last week, as we saw, they were sort of a dysfunctional family. They didn't get along. And Joseph's brothers, 10 brothers, were out in the field tending the flocks. And his father said to him, go check on them. Go be word back on how they're doing. So the first place that Joseph went, they were supposed to be, and they heard he was coming, so they moved. Then they saw him coming from afar, in the second place they were at, and it says, let's do something. Let's get rid of him. He's our father's favorite son. He's always telling us how much better he is than we are. So they plotted to kill him and throw him in a pit. And they threw him in a pit, and one of the brothers says, well, let's not kill him. There's a caravan coming by that's going to Egypt. Let's sell him to these people. So that's what they did. So that's sort of a nutshell of what last Sunday's lesson is about. So we're going to talk about this Sunday about Joseph being in charge and forgiveness. In the 1990s, John Graves had a nonfiction book called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And he spent a long time on the New York's bestseller list. One of the book's key points in that communication was communication and forgiveness, and are important in maintaining healthy relationships. In many circumstances, people could settle misunderstandings with communications and could repair broken relationships with forgiveness. Joseph and his brothers didn't communicate well, and when they all lived together. Now they must face each other again after being apart for decades. Let's think about how communication and forgiveness have made a difference in the story of Joseph and his brothers, and also consider how that can affect our own relationships. Another story this morning was Alexander Dumas. And he wrote one of the most famous stories of revenge, the Count of Monte Cristo. In that story, Edmond Dantes' good fortune turns to jealousy of his 3 so-called friends. One envied his success, one wanted his fiancée, and one was jealous of his good luck. As a result of the process, Dante was sent to life in prison. And there he meets Abbé Ferrer, an Italian priest, whose daily lessons turned Dante into a well-educated man. The priest also tells him how to find a large treasure hidden on an island of Monte Cristo. Would he ever escape? And he did. And he took this, and he was there for 10 years. And he finally entered the Parisian society as the Count of Monte Cristo. He insinuates himself into the lives of his 3 enemies, none of whom recognize him. At that point, he sets into motion an elaborate scheme and eventually leads to the disgrace and death of his former enemies. His revenge is complete. But now we see Joseph going to take a different path in dealing with his enemies, the brothers who sought to destroy his life. Instead of devising a plot to revenge in which he gets even with these siblings who hurt him, Joseph devised a plan of restoration in which he shares his blessings with them and their families. Apparently, Joseph does not adopt this stance of forgiveness the moment he sees them, nor is he willing to trust his brothers until he first ascertains the condition of their hearts. We see this testing period in Genesis 42 through 44. H.G. Wells wrote a famous novel about a time machine which enables someone to travel into both the past and the future. Wouldn't it be nice to have such a machine, or maybe at least a crystal ball, so that we can see what the future will bring? When we're in the midst of trouble, we wonder how life can possibly turn out well. Joseph probably wondered about that. After all, his life seemed to go from one problem to another. He had to wonder how things could possibly turn out for good, but he learned that God can work for good, even in the most difficult times. Our first set of scripture this morning comes from Genesis 45, verses 1 through 3. Then Joseph could no longer control himself. All those who stood by him and cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians could hear it, and the household of the Pharaoh heard it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Our second set of scriptures is Genesis 45, 4 through 8. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. He said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in this land for these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve you for a remnant on earth, and to keep you alive for many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me a favor to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the lands of Egypt." And our last set of scriptures is verses 45, 9 through 15. "Hurry up and go to my father, and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, and you and your children and your children's children, as well as your flocks and your herds, and all you have, will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that this is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt, and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here." Then he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that his brothers talked with him. After he was pulled from the pit and sold to the Passion traders, Joseph is taken to Egypt and sold as a slave to the Potiphar, an officer in the Pharaoh's court. Joseph is then imprisoned after the Potiphar's wife falsely accused him of inappropriate sexual behaviors. After successfully interpreting the dreams of 2 fellow prisoners and of the Pharaoh, Joseph is made second in command to the Egyptian rulers. He is put in charge of stockpiling grain during the 7 good harvest years, and of the distributing the grain during the ensuing 7 years of famine. Joseph's brothers come to him twice during the famine to acquire food for their families. The encounter in our lesson text takes place during the second visit. Joseph's interactions with his brothers so far has been through an interpreter, so they are unaware that their little brother is still alive and standing before them. Joseph has treated his brothers to a fabulous banquet, and now he prepares to reveal himself to them. The turning point in Joseph's testing of his brothers revolves around Benjamin, Jacob's youngest son, whose mother is Rachel. So he and Joseph are full brothers, and the other 10 are half-brothers. Joseph and his servants place his favorite silver cup in Benjamin's sack before the brothers head back to Canaan. He then sends his servants after them to accuse them of stealing this cup. When the servants find the cup in Benjamin's sack, they bring back the entourage back to Egypt, where Joseph announces that he will keep him in prison for thievery. He dismisses the rest of the group. Instead of deserting their brothers that he early deserted Joseph, Judah offers to take Benjamin's place so that Jacob's favorite son can be restored to his adoring father. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? He cries in anguish. This response convinces Jacob that his brothers have indeed changed. Only then does he decide to reveal his identity. When they're alone and emotional, Joseph drops a bombshell on his brothers. I am Joseph, he declares. Despite Joseph's apparent sincerity, his announcement leaves them speechless. So dismayed were they at his presence. The early discussion among the brothers on their first trip to Egypt reflects they still agonize over what they did to Joseph, even though many years have passed. They interpret their problems with the ruler of Egypt as payback for their sins. Imagine what they think now when they realize the ruler of Egypt with whom they are dealing is none other than the one whom they did wrong. Joseph's emotions bleeds through again in his question about his father's welfare. Is my father still living? He asked. Because of the excessive attention Jacob gave Joseph, Joseph's relationship with his father went beyond the normal father-son relationships. Perhaps that is clear what he missed most when his brothers displaced him from his family and home. After all these years, Joseph's concern immediately turns to his father's welfare. Can you imagine the impact on these sons of Jacob when the man they think is a ruler of Egypt announces, I am Joseph, then reminds them of what they did to him? Shock, disbelief merge as they take a closer look at the man standing before them. As recognition comes, shock and disbelief morph into terror. The memory of what they did to Joseph and the realization of what Joseph can now do to them shakes them through the foundation of their being. But does he plan to do that? Joseph places the relationship between him and his brothers in the context of a larger story of God's redemptive plan for God's covenant people. Joseph focuses on this larger story as he explains to his brothers what happened and why. We do not know when Joseph became aware of this larger story. He clearly felt God's guidance in his life much earlier, for he recognized the presence of the Lord with him even in prison. Further, when Pharaoh commended Joseph on his ability to interpret dreams, Joseph immediately objected. It's not I, Joseph promised. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Likewise, in the incident in our text, Joseph clearly discusses that neither the actions of his brothers that sent him to Egypt, nor his mentor's rise to power since arriving in Egypt have happened accidentally. Instead, God is moving in Joseph's life to unfold his plans. Therefore, Joseph tells his brothers that God used them to bring about this moment to Egypt for a greater good. Joseph also grasps the reason behind God's activities in his life. God did not put Joseph into an exalted position in order to reward him. Instead, God placed Joseph in an exalted position in order to fulfill two purposes. First, Joseph's leadership in preparing resources for 7 years of drought will enable him to save many lives from starvation during this period of need by providing physical relief. God's grander purpose is to provide spiritual relief for the world through the covenant people, and God will do that by preserving a remnant of Israel. Joseph also promises his brothers that God will keep alive for you many survivors. The New International Version translates promise from God in these words, but God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. The term remnant and deliverance are converted words that means Joseph used to explain God's activities. This is the first appearance of the key word remnant, which appears more than 60 times in the Bible. The remnant is a small group of God's people who remain after a period of dislocation or judgment, a remnant of people through whom God continues to carry out his redemptive work. The remnant idea appears often in the prophets. in Ezekiel, in Amos, and Isaiah, all allude to this promise of a remnant. Yet long before the prophets will speak this message to their generation, Joseph grasps this idea and shares it with his brothers. The drought and Joseph's plans to prepare for it provide the backdrop against which God implements God's covenant plan, and that began with the promise to Abraham and will accumulate in the coming of Jesus, the Messiah. That is why Joseph can assure his brothers, "So it is not you who sent me here, but God." Joseph is still their brothers, but in the providence of God, he has become much more than that. He identifies his new status with three terms. First, his father to the Pharaoh. Perhaps Joseph means that, like a father advises his son, he has become the Pharaoh's most trusted advisor. Second, he is Lord of all house. In other words, Joseph has complete physical control over all the family affairs of the Pharaoh. Finally, he identifies himself as the ruler of all the land of Egypt. All the Egyptian people submit to his rule. Joseph does not put forth these terms as an official title bestowed on him. Instead, he presents them as the scripture phrases that reflect the full scope of his power and position. At least for that instant, the brothers' terrors return as Joseph makes statements that reflect the extent of his powers. A person of such power can crush his brothers if he chooses to do so. However, he can also use his power to lift his brothers and their family out of their distressing experience of drought. Joseph opts to use his power in the second way. He recognizes that both Egypt and Canaan are locked in a terrible drought, and he understands because of the Pharaoh's dreams that the drought will last another 5 years. He sees two options for his brothers. They can make repeated trips to Egypt to renew their supply of food, or they can come down to Egypt where Joseph will provide them out of the supply he has gathered in the storehouse of Pharaoh. He encourages his brothers to take the second option. He explains that they will not be able to survive if they stay in Canaan. They must come to Egypt where they will be safe and where they will have available all the resources they need to make it through the remaining years of the drought. Again, notice Joseph's reference to his position and his authority. He instructs them to tell their father, "I am honored in Egypt," and urges them to recount to their father all that they have seen, including the difference paid to Joseph and the absolute authority placed in his hands. Joseph does not parade his power before his brothers to make them feel bad, but to instill confidence in them. He wants to assure them that he can provide for Jacob and his family when they move to Egypt. Having presented to his brothers his instruction, Joseph once again gives way to his emotion. Notice the special attention he gives to Benjamin, whom he shares a mother, yet he does not neglect the other brothers. The hurt caused by the earlier actions toward him has dissolved in the river of passing time and in the unstoppable flow of God's unfolding purpose. And what do we learn from this experience in the life of Joseph? From the brothers, we learn that people can change. The indifferent brothers who earlier discarded this younger brother like a piece of garbage without a flicker of concern and about how it would affect their father have been replaced by compassionate brothers who are burdened by what might happen to their youngest brother and how this will affect their father Joseph. Like these brothers, we too can change. From Joseph, we learn that people can forgive. Joseph could have taken the unique opportunity presented him to get his revenge on his brothers for their callous actions that led to his slavery and imprisonment. Instead, he chose a higher path. He chose to forgive. He does not have to forget his brothers. He does not have to bring them to Egypt and provide for them during their 5 years of famine. Yet he discriminates the big heart that we see repeatedly in human history, that enables a person to arise above their plans and forgive those. And from God, we learn about God's anonymous activity in the lives of God's people. Joseph's brothers sell him as a slave so he can meet the Potiphar, and the Potiphar's wife accuses him falsely so he can be sent to prison and interpret the dreams. And the Pharaoh's cupbearer, he can eventually interpret the dreams. He interprets Pharaoh's dream. He becomes prime minister of Egypt. This brings him back in touch with his brothers. So we just see how this history has all evolved in Joseph and his brothers. And Joseph chose to forgive his brothers, and I think he chose to forget his brothers. I've also heard the phrase, I will forgive you, but I will not forget. If the person says that to you, he has not forgiven you because he has not forgot. Joseph forgot and forgave his brothers of what they had done to him. And I close in prayer. Oh Lord, sometimes we can't or won't see how you are working in our lives. Help us remember to give thanks for your guidance, whether we see it now or we realize it later. Amen. Thank you for tuning in.